There seems to be a pretty strong link between insulin resistance and a fatty liver. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? And how do we go about tackling this? There's a number of different genes that are expressed that are related with fat being stored in the liver, okay? But a lot of these genes can still be very similar to genes that affect insulin resistance, indirectly through having a fatty liver, right? So when we look at something interesting called palmitoleic acid, it kind of gets us curious. Now, palmitoleic acid is what is called an omega-7 fat. It is one of 8 different omega-7s, okay? Now, palmitoleic acid is really abundant in things like macadamia nuts. So that's why I'm suggesting that maybe macadamia nuts are something that we should be eating if we're really watching out for insulin resistance, and maybe we're just trying to do what we can to protect against a fatty liver. I'm not saying it's going to diagnose, cure, treat anything, but there's some cool evidence. So let's break down the research with palmitoleic acid. Today's video is sponsored by Hiya. If you have kids, then you know that giving them the right kind of nutrition can be difficult sometimes. So I put a link down below to something called Hiya. They are a kids multivitamin that's sweetened with monk fruit. Okay, it's got 12 different fruits and veggies in it. It is awesome. Okay, I've been giving it to my kiddo just because it's like a treat for him. It's sweetened with monk fruit. It's just fun for him, and it's something that I take too. So I know that there's a lot of parents that watch this channel just because I talk about children's health and I talk about what I do with my kids from time to time. So I wanted to make sure that I put that out there. So there's a link down below if you're looking for a multivitamin that isn't like the typical sugary multivitamin, really in a league of its own, you want to check them out. And the cool thing is, because they're a sponsor on this channel, that is a 50% off link. Okay, so get 50% off your first order of Hiya. And it's super fun for the kids too. Like, you can decorate the bottle, all kinds of stuff. Again, thank you to Hiya for the sponsorship on this channel to make sure that we can create the content that we can create. So there was a study that was conducted on mice, and these were called KKAY mice. These are mice that have been sort of genetically altered to become diabetic. And I've talked about this in other like macadamia nut videos before. So it's interesting because what they did is they gave these mice that were genetically diabetic palmitoleic acid. Okay, they gave them 300 milligrams of palmitoleic acid per kilogram of body weight every day for 4 weeks. So they found some pretty interesting stuff with this. They found that their insulin sensitivity had improved. They found that their hyperglycemia had improved. So, which is really saying a lot for mice that are genetically diabetic now, right? The fact that they were able to improve hyperglycemia just with palmitoleic acid is pretty darn fascinating. But there were other things that they found in this study that were specific to a fatty liver as well. They found that palmitoleic acid suppressed specific genes that were associated with fatty liver accumulation, or accumulating fat in the liver rather. So these particular genes, we're talking about SREB1, we're talking about FAS and SCD. Now I want you to think of these genes as workers that are on a freight train, like an old school locomotive, okay, where you're shoveling coal into the engine to be able to create the engine to move, right, to create power. Well, without those workers shoveling coal, then it doesn't really work, right? Well, the same kind of thing applies to the liver. These genes were sort of like the coal workers. They're shoveling fat into the liver, and if we can kind of down-regulate that expression of those genes, then we are kind of turning off the process in which we store fat in the liver. So pretty darn fascinating. But then there was another study that was published in Diabetologia that was a pretty intense study that covered a lot of different things, talking about palmitoleic acid, talking about this stuff. But what I found most interesting was their level of intrigue with what's called AMPK. Okay, AMPK is our energy sensor within the body. So that determines kind of like if we're fasted, AMPK goes up because it says, okay, we are the sensor for energy. So when energy demand is higher than what's available, then AMPK goes up. So if I'm working out in a fasted state, my energy demand is very, very high, but my actual supply is low. So AMPK goes up in an effort to liberate fats, to get fats out of the system into the bloodstream to provide my body with fuel, or to liberate carbohydrates out of the tissue, out of the muscle to give my body fuel. So that energy sensor says, hey, we're desperate for fuel, so release stored fuel, okay? Now AMPK also drives up insulin sensitivity, okay? So if we have an increase in AMPK, we have a potential increase in GLUT4 translocation and GLUT4 sensitivity. GLUT4 is going to be what captures the glucose out of the bloodstream and pulls it into the muscle cell. When you do that, you do improve insulin sensitivity simply because you're reducing circulating glucose, reducing how it's constantly getting impacted. So think of it like a white noise machine or like a fan. If that fan's on all the time, eventually you're not sensitive to it anymore. You don't even recognize that the fan is on. But if you occasionally turn the fan off and then turn it back on, then you're going to hear it because you're sensitive to it. Same kind of thing with glucose. If glucose is constantly circulating and constantly high, it's constant noise, and your body just kind of adapts to it. Okay, you're no longer sensitive. But if you can lower that a little bit every now and then by increasing the amount that gets sucked up into the muscles and stuff like that, well then, yes, then you develop sensitivity again. Then when you do have glucose going again, your body's like, oh, I gotta do something with this, rather than just being kind of numb to it. So sure, we prevent the desensitization, but we also have an effect on a fatty liver. There are numerous studies that have demonstrated that AMPK can have an effect on how much fat we store in the liver. Okay, but it can also have an effect on how much fat we burn in the liver. But then we come back to that same question. Is this directly happening, or is it indirectly happening as a result of insulin resistance going down? Like if insulin resistance goes down, insulin sensitivity improves, then we have an improvement in fatty liver. So it still beg the question of like which came first, the chicken or the egg. But I have one other study to talk about that was super fascinating. So this study was also published in the journal Diabetologia. Okay, this took a look at 1,234 participants at baseline and then 3 years later. And they were measuring something that's called palmitoleic. Now palmitoleic is the level of circulating palmitoleic acid in our bodies. What's wild is our bodies can produce palmitoleic acid, palmitoleic, endogenously. We can produce it ourselves. That's how important it is. When our body creates something itself, we know it's important, right? So here's what they found. They found that there was an association between higher levels of palmitoleic and whole body insulin sensitivity, and a negative association with insulin resistance. So thereby we see, okay, there is definitely a potential there for just palmitoleic acid to drive these values up and down. But they also saw an improvement in beta cell function. Okay, beta cells are the cells within our pancreas that produce insulin. If we have an improvement in how those cells function, we have an improvement in how our body produces insulin and thereby deals with carbohydrates. Okay, that's great for the insulin sensitivity piece, great for the insulin resistance piece, but it's also potentially good for the fatty liver piece, okay? By, again, doing that same thing, by not knowing which comes first, the chicken or the egg, but working along similar pathways, we can sort of elucidate that it probably has an impact on a fatty liver as well. So the point here isn't to just say, you're gonna eat macadamia nuts and you're gonna magically, cure yourself. That's not how this works at all. But it's to start doing more research and figure out how monounsaturated fats in general, how omega-7s in general, could be playing a huge role in our metabolic conditioning, metabolic health in the first place. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.